So, my name is Annie Atkins, and I'm a graphic designer for filmmaking, which means that I make all the graphic design pieces that the actors have to interact with and engage with on set. So, the graphic props and the graphic set pieces. But when I say graphic design, it doesn't necessarily have to be a complicated piece of graphic design. It could be something as simple as a tiny handwritten note that you need a magnifying glass to read. And then other times it might be pieces on a larger scale, for example, patterns for carpets and floor tiles or lettering for signage in the background. And then other times it is more complicated, like if you have to design an entire national press for Wes Anderson's fictitious Empire of Zubrovka. Basically, anytime you see a character in a movie read a newspaper, somebody has to make that newspaper. And I hope that by the end of the talk today, you'll understand why we never just use a newspaper that's lying around. We always design everything from scratch. These are all slides from the Grand Budapest Hotel, and I'm going to talk about that in some detail. It makes a great case study for graphic design in filmmaking because of the way Wes Anderson shoots his movies. He really puts graphics at the center and at the forefront of the film, whereas most of my work, about 90% of my work, is actually supposed to be in the blurry background, right? You're not supposed to see it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the other work, the other projects that I've worked on first. So my first job after I graduated from film school was on a TV series called The Tudors, which we made in Ireland where I live about 10 years ago now. And I went for an interview as the assistant in the art department. But when I showed them my portfolio, because I came from a graphic design background, they saw that I had a portfolio full of commercial graphic design, and they said, we're actually looking for a full-time graphic designer on the show at the moment. I thought this was quite peculiar, because why would you need a full-time graphic designer on a show that was set in a time before graphic designers existed, right? But as I did my training, I realized quite quickly that just because there were no graphic designers in the 15th century didn't mean there was no graphic design. It's just that at that time, it would have been the craftspeople who were the graphic designers, right? So for example, if Henry VIII wants to chop his wife's head off, he's going to need a death warrant. And if he needs a death warrant, he's going to need a calligrapher, right? Because at the time, it would have been the calligrapher's job to design the layout of all the royal documents and the style of the lettering. And then likewise, if we're making any kind of set that has stained glass in it, for example, in the 15th century, it would have been the glazier who was responsible for the design of the glass. Whereas today in filmmaking, it's the graphic designer's job to try and imitate what they would have done. And then we can go back a few hundred years to Roman times. If you've got any kind of headstone or tombstone, at the time, it would have been the stonemason who was responsible for the style of the lettering that they carve into the stone. And today, it's the graphic designer's job in film to imitate what they would have done. And then we can jump forwards a few hundred years to a time after the invention of the printing press, who would have been responsible for the graphic design of zoo information boards in the late 1800s. It would have been the printer who was the graphic designer, okay? So I think like the term graphic designer wasn't coined until, I think, the 1920s. But we can say that graphic design has existed since as far back as cavemen were painting on their walls, right? So as I began to work on more and more different TV shows and films about like Roman emperors and kings and so on and so forth, I began to set a little rule for myself, and that was that if something was made by hand at the time, then I should make it by hand now. And if something was made by a machine at the time, then I can get away with making it with a machine now, okay? So for example, any kind of Victorian shopfront signage would have been painted by hand at the time. I draw the lettering by hand now. It's given to the sign painters on set, and they paint it up into the film set for us. But things like street posters, which would have been perhaps letterpress printed at the time, I can now cheat and use fonts and work on it digitally on my Mac, okay? So this is a piece that I made for the TV show Penny Dreadful, which is a kind of gothic horror series. And it was the Grand Guignol Theatre, so we made this big cast iron stained glass theatre front. And the first thing I did was I started drawing the lettering by hand rather than use a font, because it would have been created by hand at the time. I think the show was set in 1894, I think. And also, drawing the lettering by hand means that no two letters are ever going to be exactly the same, and you get these really lovely organic shapes and curves. I find that if I start with a font when it's not supposed to be a font, I'll spend all day battling against it to try to stop it looking like a font, right? It's easier to just pick up a pencil. And then later on, I digitize it, and I bring it into Photoshop and Illustrator and whatever else I need to make a proper architectural technical drawing that's then issued to the various metal workers and glaziers who are actually going to make this piece for us. And then when all the pieces are made, they're brought down to the paint workshop, and the painters then add all the color and the texture. Because this wasn't actually glass, it was made of Perspex, because in filmmaking, we really have to use materials that are cheaper and lighter and safer than perhaps the real materials that would have been used at the time. Because this was a piece that was going to be on set up above the actors' heads, you know, so you don't want to chop an actor's head off, you'll never work again. But of course, not all the signage that we make for film has to be like this beautiful, elaborate, stained glass piece. A lot of the signage we make is used when we shoot on location, when we're shooting real street scenes. We have to make a really high volume of graphic material to cover up existing modern advertising. This is the opening sequence to Steven Spielberg's film Bridge of Spies, which is it's a Cold War spy thriller, and it's also a true story. So Spielberg wanted us in the art department to really kind of recreate 1950s Brooklyn for him. So our primary aim then in the art department is to establish the period and to establish the location. So that the cinema audience know, as soon as they start watching the film, they know where they are and they know when the story is set. But I really think that that's kind of a given, that we're going to set the time and the place. You know, that's kind of the lowest bar. I think we can do something cleverer in our design for film than that as well, and that's that we can use the design to actually tell the story and drive the story forward. So if you see a sign in the background that says, "Walk, don't run," for example, you can bet any second now those characters are probably going to start running. There they go. So we can use graphic design and use of language to really drive a story forward and almost become a part of the action itself, you know, even if it is just a subliminal part of the action. But what if the film that you're working on isn't a true story? What if the film that you're working on is set in a much more fantastical or even mythological land? Well, I think the process is actually surprisingly similar. This is an animated feature, The Box Trolls, that I worked on for the studio Laika. And it's about all these monsters who live underneath the ground and they wear cardboard boxes as their clothes. And Laika brought me into the project to help design the packaging labels that would go on top of the cardboard boxes. Let's take a look at the trailer.
Sometimes there's a mother. Sometimes there's a father. Sometimes there's a father and a father. Sometimes both fathers are mothers. Sometimes there's a mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, weird aunties with funny hats, a butler, and old uncles who do nothing but eat rare, smelly cheese.
Rare. Smelly.
And sometimes there's no one at all. But sometimes there are boxes. Families come in all shapes and sizes, even rectangles.
It's such a lovely film. So you can see that a story like this is kind of much more imaginary than something like Bridge of Spies, which is a true story. But when I started the project, I actually started I approached it in exactly the same way that I approach all film projects, and that is to dive into research and try and steal and borrow and take from real life. The Box Trolls was set in a kind of loosely Victorian world, so I started researching packaging design from the late 1800s, and I found all these beautiful kind of medicinal packaging, copper plate engravings. And they all seem to be cure-alls for any known ailment. I like this nerve builder, brain tonic, and stimulant, which seems to be made entirely out of celery. And my other favorite was Dr. Warden's female pills for weak women. So I took them to the production designer, and we used them as our starting point. But one thing that he stipulated was that the way he was designing the overall look of the movie was that he wasn't going to have any straight lines in it whatsoever. So there would be no straight lines in any of the set design or architecture, there would be no straight lines in any of the characters, and there would be no straight lines in any of the graphic design either. So for the duration of the project, not one person in the art department used a ruler. Right? And we brought this into the lettering as well. So all the lettering you see in the movie was drawn by hand. We didn't use any fonts whatsoever. And it meant that everything kept this lovely kind of organic, curvy lines, which I think contributed to the movement and the energy of the movie, bearing in mind that, this was actually all models made essentially out of clay. Yeah? I think it really contributed to the energy of things. Okay, let's look at the Grand Budapest Hotel. So, this is the Grand Budapest Hotel that was designed by the production designer Adam Stockhausen with Wes Anderson, the director, and they brought me in to create all the graphic pieces for it. And on the left is the hotel that they designed, and on the right is the real hotel in the Czech Republic that was the inspiration for them, okay? So we're always, even if the film seems to have quite a fantastical premise or a fantastical look to it, we're always borrowing from real life. And then this is the actual building that we worked in, which is an old department store in a little town in the east of Germany called Görlitz on the Polish border. And it was a really interesting building to work in, actually, because on the inside it had this beautiful balcony mezzanine structure, and we shot all our hotel scenes on the ground floor, and the art department sat on the top floor. But because of the balcony structure, it meant that we could actually look down and see the action that was happening below us, which was a real treat, because usually the art department on a film is in a building next door to the set, or we're in some kind of cold warehouse somewhere, or in a porter cabin in a muddy field. So this was quite nice. So I'm going to take you through the process of how we start designing graphics for film. The first thing I do on my first day at work is I sit down with a script, and I take a highlighter pen, and I go through the whole script, and I start marking out anything that sounds like it might be a piece of graphic design, okay? This is just the first page of the Grand Budapest Hotel. Well, it's the first half of the first page of the script for the Grand Budapest. And because there's so many highlighting marks on it, I knew immediately that it was going to be a high volume of graphics. So we hired a local German graphic designer, Liliana Labrive, who came in to work with us, and then also a couple of PAs, and together the four of us made up the little graphics department, which was part of the bigger art department for the movie. And while I'm highlighting all the pieces of graphics in the script, I'm also filling in what we call a script breakdown, which is essentially a spreadsheet of all the pieces that we're going to have to make. And this becomes then my Bible for the show, so that anytime I need to know how to make something, I have a quick reference guide to it, so I don't have to go through the script again. And some things are really obviously pieces of graphics, right? Like a menu. We know that if a character picks up a menu and starts to read, menus are made by graphic designers, we're going to make this piece, right? But then other pieces, I think, are less obvious. For example, if a character dries another character's eyes with a handkerchief, we need to ask ourselves, is that handkerchief going to have a pattern on it? And if it has a pattern on it, is that something that we are going to take responsibility for in the graphics department? Is it something that costume are going to come up with? Or is it something we're going to use from real life? With the Grand Budapest Hotel, because Wes has a very specific and distinct style, we really did create everything from scratch. And then while we're making our script breakdowns, the assistant directors are doing an even more complicated job, and that is that they're scheduling every shot in the entire movie. So they're deciding where we're going to shoot things and when we're going to shoot things. Because we never shoot a film in story order. Instead, they prioritize two main things, location and actor availability. So with location, we would shoot all our hotel scenes in one go, maybe over a couple of weeks, and then all our prison scenes in one go, over however many weeks that takes. And then they account for actor availability as well. The one thing they don't care about when they write the schedule is graphic design, okay? We're the bottom of the food chain. But because we don't shoot in story order, we have a problem with what we call continuity, okay? And I'll explain continuity in terms of graphic design. Say, for example, you have a telegram, and the telegram is ripped up and covered in blood. Well, first of all, we never make just one telegram, okay? We never make just one of any piece of graphic design, because graphics by their nature tend to be quite fragile. They're usually made out of paper, okay? So if somebody spills a coffee on a graphic, it's ruined. If somebody spills a coffee on a candlestick, you can wipe the candlestick clean again, right? But graphics tend to get destroyed really easily. So we never make any one of any piece. Instead, we always make maybe 5 or 6 identical copies. Now, these copies have to be identical because of continuity. So if you have 2 actors talking to each other and they have the telegram in their hand and one actor misses a line, they put the telegram down on the table, someone spills a coffee on the telegram, they pick up a different telegram that's not identical. 6 months down the line, the editor is splicing the shots together and they don't match. It's going to look like the blood is jumping around the page, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. So instead, we make them identical and then continuity isn't a problem, right? But what happens if the telegram isn't just ripped up and covered in blood, but it's ripped up and covered in blood in front of the camera, okay, which is what we call an action graphic. So something actually happens to the graphic in the action. In that case, we have to make as many identical copies as they might need to do takes for, okay? So for example, they might want to do 6, 7, maybe 8 takes of any given shot to get it right. Then we supply our 12 identical copies so that they have more than enough to work with. Okay, so nobody's running up to the art department looking for more telegrams because these things take time to make. But then what happens if you're working on a Wes Anderson movie when he maybe wants to do 20 takes of any given shot, 22, 23, 24? Then we make our 30 identical copies, okay? So, I mean, does it matter? Like, how much does continuity matter? I mean, our attention is really on humans, right? The camera is on people's faces and on the drama that's unfolding between people. People aren't really watching for continuity errors in graphics, are they? This is what happens. You end up on the IMDb Goofs page. So, on the train, Henkels gives Gustav a permit with a folded corner. In the close-up, the permit has no folds. 5 out of 9 people found this interesting. The thing is, they're right. You know, this was the permit we made, and I think you can see immediately that this wasn't something that we just pressed go on a photocopier 10 times or however many it was. You know, first of all, we sourced this beautiful Japanese paper that would take aging really well, and then we did some digital printing on it, and then we put it through a 1930s typewriter, and then we made some rubber stamps to do our franking marks, and then we made an envelope for it because there was no envelope in the world that was exactly the right size. And then we made our 12 identical copies, and one of them didn't have the folded corner. When Jack is at the gas station, the calendar on the wall says October 1932, but shows October 5th, 12th, 19th, and 26th as Sundays. In 1932, those dates fell on Wednesdays. 30 out of 35 people found this interesting. Again, they're right. When we made the calendar, we didn't think to check the dates against the days, but we didn't think anybody else would either. And one last one, every newspaper that features a date has the wrong day of the week. 21 out of 29 people found that interesting. Again, they're right. I'm not really bothered by this. I think it's funny. I like to show it to people, but I'm not really worried about it. I don't feel like it's really that these people have a beef with our work. I think it's more that they're having a competition with each other. They're freeze framing the DVD. But I do think it's a good example of how much detail we actually do go into and get right if this is what they've got on us, right? And then other mistakes actually are embarrassing. We were about halfway through the shoot when Wes got in touch and said, I think there's a spelling mistake on the Mendel's box. And I said, I don't think so, because I take great pride in my spelling and grammar. I'm quite careful with it. And he said, no, I think there seems to be 2 T's in patisserie. And I looked at it, and he was right. There was a spelling mistake on the Mendel's box. And because all the lettering had been drawn by hand, it had never been through a spell check. And my mistake was that I didn't double check that. So this really was embarrassing, because at this point, we'd shot quite a lot of Mendel's boxes. I think 2,000 of them. So it was something that had to be fixed in post-production, which is a kind of a lengthy process when you're fixing 25 frames per second, and it's quite costly. And then, of course, after the movie, the box, it almost became a symbol for the movie. It was a kind of a hero prop, and it took on a life of its own. So I started seeing people selling fakes on eBay, but I always know if they're the real thing or not, because if it's got the spelling mistake in it, then it was actually in the movie, right? So if you see a box for sale with 2 T's in patisserie, you should buy it. And then sometimes people ask me about the kerning, the strange kerning and the sign above the hotel. Can you see it seems like there's a little bit too much space between the A and the N in Grand, and also maybe between the D and the A in Budapest. You can see that, yeah? Again, this lettering was hand-lettered, and the hotel that we built was a scale model, so it was only ever about 9 foot high. It was shot against that green screen, and then later on it was superimposed onto that beautiful alpine background that you see in the film. So I drew the lettering by hand, and I sent the drawing to Wes, and he approved it, and then I sent the drawing to the model makers, who cut it out of mild steel. And of course, what the model makers did, because they're also designers, is they corrected the funny kerning, right? And that photograph was then sent back to Wes, and he said, no, it should be back the way I approved it in the drawing. Like that. But why? Why would you want to put a mistake like that in your movie? Well, because we're always taking from real life, right? So this is the sign that we used as the inspiration, which is on a real grand old hotel in Cairo, in Egypt, I think. And it's clear what's happened here, right? At some point in history, that E has fallen off the roof, and someone else has climbed back up a ladder and put it back up again, right? So what we're trying to do in film is take and steal and borrow from the real world around us that has been built by incredible craftspeople over decades and decades. And then we can get a step closer to creating something that feels like it might be authentic, right? The graphics department is just it's a small part of a much larger art department, and the art department in turn is another cog in the wheel of a much larger filmmaking process. But I do think that if you concentrate on the little details that are your responsibility, then you can contribute to something that is a much bigger picture. you very much. Thank you.
Well, that was delightful. So I want to know if when you make something that says "walk, don't run" in the background, do you get satisfaction from me noticing that, or do you get satisfaction from me not noticing that and maybe feeling it?
Well, I don't think you're supposed to notice it.
Yeah.
Like, I think, you know, most of my work shouldn't really be seen. I think Grand Budapest is a bit of an exception because of the way Wes uses graphics in his filmmaking. But most of the films I work on, you shouldn't really notice the graphics at all. You should be concentrating on the characters. But subconsciously, you're noticing it.
Is there an IMDb page of things, clever things that you put into things? Fucking internet. Yeah.
That would be good, though. I might start one myself.
Yeah, we should do that. That'd be nice. So tell me about the research you do. Do you enjoy the research phase of this?
Yeah, research is a huge part of it. I usually start work on a film about 6 to 8 weeks before the camera starts rolling, and I use most of that time to research the period, because usually the period is completely new to me. You know, I've worked on a few films that have been all set in like Victorian times, for example, but usually the period is completely new, and I need to do an awful lot of research, yeah.
And what's the nature of that kind of research?
I try not to look too much at Google. It can be quite misleading. Nothing on the internet is labeled correctly.
Fucking internet.
Yeah. So if you have to make a telegram, you know, I don't know what size a telegram is by looking at a picture of it on a screen. You know, I really need to hold it in my hands to understand the scale of it and also the texture of the paper. So a lot of the time I'm going to flea markets or libraries or bookshops or museums or like even just like rifling through your grandmother's attic, you know, you'll find treasure there.
Wow. So you have to actually hold it to know how you're going to make it. And so you do all this research, but is there occasionally this situation where, kind of like the squiggly line drawings in Boxtrolls, where the reality of the object doesn't serve the story you want to tell, and so you have to actually do something that's different than reality or hyper-real in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm always championing like looking at real pieces and being authentic to reality, but actually, of course, what we do is we start with a real piece and then it's developed by the director and the production designer to suit the story at hand. Yeah, absolutely.
And what are some examples of that type of, something that like, that always has to change because it never matches reality in that certain way that you would expect?
I would say newspaper design is something that comes up time and time again. Every movie you watch has got a newspaper in it. You know?
Yeah.
Are you going to spend millions of dollars shooting a war, or are you going to have somebody reading a newspaper that says there's a war on?
Right. It's cheaper.
Yeah. But actually, broadsheet newspaper design at the start of the last century didn't have headlines. It was all, the front page of the Times in England, for example, was all small adverts.
Right.
So, I mean, I take that information to the director and the production designer and say, this is really what it was like. And then it's their call whether they stick with historical accuracy or they say, we need a newspaper headline, make that headline bigger.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm sorry to bring up the tragedy of the Mendel box, but how much of what you can do can be fixed in post, and has that changed over your career? And do you ever have it in mind when you're, as a salve, when you're making something that you know that you could possibly do it?
I should say no, we never want to fix anything post. We're always trying to get it right for the camera, but I think there is a point in any production where you can see the whole kind of props team start groaning, oh, just fix it in post. But I mean, my career in film has only really been the last 10 years, so we've always been able to fix things in post, but no, we should avoid it wherever possible.
Wherever possible, yeah. But you know, sometimes.
Sometimes.
It's okay. How did you get into this? How did you start bridging this world between graphic design and filmmaking?
You know, I didn't know this was a career. All my life I've been into design and graphic design. I studied graphic design, and all my life, obviously, I've been watching movies. But I never put two and two together, really, until I went to do my master's degree in filmmaking. So my original degree was in visual communication design, Then I did a master's in filmmaking, and all of a sudden this whole new world of design was opened up to me.
Wow.
And the production designer from the Tudors actually came into our school to do a module with us, and that's how I got my start.
Yeah, and now you teach this to other people.
Yeah, so now I run workshops from my own studio in Dublin, trying to teach commercial graphic designers and design graduates how to translate their existing skills into filmmaking.
So they don't have to go to film school like you did.
Yeah, I mean, even in film school, like they don't really teach graphic design for filmmaking. It's such a tiny part of the filmmaking machine.
Yeah.
It's really a niche area, but I think, don't be afraid of being niche.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to specialize.
That's great. Thank you so much, Annie Atkinson.
Thank you.